Hello, you're all very welcome to this webinar. My name is Orla Feely. I'm Vice-President of University College Dublin for Research, Innovation and Impact. And I'm joined by two colleagues, Professor Gallagher, who's the Director of the UCD Conway Institute for Biomolecular and Biomedical Research, and Professor Peter Doran of UCD School of Medicine, and also Director of our Clinical Research Centre. So we're going to be talking about the COVID-19 pandemic, the scientific research and clinical response to the pandemic, and delighted to have Liam and Peter with us. This follows up another webinar also organised by UCD Foundation that we ran last week, which you can see on YouTube with Cillian de Gascoigne and Paddy Mallon. Really great experience there. So let's see then if we can take up that line of conversation and delve in to get further information for you about what's happening in relation to the pandemic. So Liam, I'll start with you. Can you tell us a bit about what is going on in the UCD Conway Institute at the moment in relation to COVID-19?
Hi Orla, thanks very much. Yeah, I suppose just more generally, we've seen this, in terms of the pandemic, the key aspect of the pandemic is really centered around diagnostics, the ability to detect the virus. And within the Conway, investigators there actually participated in some of the early work with the patients who were infected with the virus in Ireland in terms of sequencing of the virus. And so this was work that was carried out in collaboration with the National Virus Reference Laboratory. And what this really showed was critical work really was looking at, I suppose, the original origin of the virus. Obviously, everybody knows that the virus originally originated from Wuhan city. So some of the earlier strains of the virus came from there, but also laterally came from northern Italy. Within the Conway, we have a variety of different investigators who have really key expertise in infectious disease, virologists. We also have clinicians working in that space. And for example, one of the projects that's taking place is a very interesting project with Professor Paddy Mallon, Virginie Gauthier, and also Professor Gil Lee, who is a Conway Fellow. Because one of the critical problems early on during testing for the virus was really a lack of suitable reagents for testing. There was a worldwide kind of shortage of reagents. And so Gil is a chemist who is an expert in really an ability to actually purify nucleic acid or the material used for testing. And they actually were able to actually develop a very novel system for really high throughput testing of the virus, which is now being tested with some of our affiliated hospitals such as St. Vincent's Hospital, and hopefully down the line will be used clinically.
Thanks, Liam. And Peter, can you tell us what's going on in the Clinical Research Centre at this time?
Sure, Orla, and thanks for the opportunity to discuss the work we've been doing over the last while. By way of background, for those who aren't familiar, the university established the Clinical Research Centre actually about 13 years ago now, mainly at the Mater in St. Vincent's Hospital. And our objective there was to provide an environment and an expert staffing that would allow our clinical investigators to ask questions that are of importance to patients. So over the last number of years, we've been developing that capacity. What that has meant for us in the clinical research context, when this new disease, COVID-19, appeared on the radar, we were very well positioned to rapidly mobilize our research response. So for example, we've been working on a number of different areas of clinical investigation around COVID-19. We have, with Paddy Mallon, who was part of last week's webinar, we have established a COVID cohort, which is a collection of samples from patients who have tested positive for COVID-19. So after patients give consent, we collect their samples, and those samples then are available to researchers, including in the Conway, to try and understand what the effect of the pathogen is on the body, because a lot of what we're finding out now is so new. This is a new disease. There's a need for us to understand it at both a clinical and a molecular level. So in addition to that type of research, then we've also very rapidly mobilized our expertise in clinical trials. Because again, as a new disease, one of the problems with COVID-19 is that our therapeutic options are very limited. The mainstay of therapeutic intervention in COVID-19 is oxygen supplementation, either on the ward or in the intensive care unit. And working with our clinical investigators, we have been designing and rolling out a number of clinical trials that are designed to test a whole range of different interventions to try and figure out if we can at least improve the clinical outcomes for patients who are struck by this disease. So the Clinical Research Centre has really been focusing on how do we take that expertise and those support capacities the university has developed over so many years and applying them to this new phenomenon that has just evolved.
And I think that's very interesting. The fact that you have this long expertise in clinical research, you're very well linked into the international networks. You have samples collected from other possibly related diseases that you can draw on. So could you say a little bit about that, the way that you draw on your history of work, the facilities you've built up, the network you have to really deliver important work here?
Absolutely, and I might give a very specific example, Orla, in that regard. There's a project, a World Health Organization project called Sprint SARI, which is effectively a collection of information about patients with acute respiratory infections. And that project has actually been running now for about 3 years and is led in Ireland by Alistair Nicholl and involves a whole range of different countries globally who have been for about 3 years collecting information on acute pneumonias. And that project has provided us with the framework that when COVID arrived, we literally could drop COVID in as a new component of that ongoing study. So all of the work we've done over the last number of years looking at influenza-like illnesses has created this awesome framework for doing and rapidly mobilizing COVID research. And I think for the research community, Orla, that really has been one of the big challenges, is this disease is moving so fast that, you know, a traditional kind of way of mobilizing research activity would actually miss the pandemic. And I'm particularly proud that a lot of the work that's been done at the Clinical Research Centre by colleagues like Paddy Mallon and like Alistair Nicholl and indeed many others over the last number of years has actually kind of prepared us for the moment when the pandemic arrived. And I think that has, you know, it's quite interesting because it has made both UCD specifically, but Ireland in general at the leading edge of some of the research now that's happening because we were ready. We had the systems and the structures in place. And that's, I think that has been a very exciting aspect of what we've done.
And Liam, the same would be true, I imagine, in the broader scientific context of the broad scientific community you have assembled within the Conway Institute who can bring their multiple talents and expertise to bear on the disease.
Yeah, I think, like, if you look at the Conway, I suppose our core expertise is really in the area of biomedical research. We have a particular interest in the area of personalized and translational medicine, but also this emerging area of One Health, which is particularly right in the sweet spot of COVID-19 or the current virus we're dealing with. But also, you know, we're currently dealing with COVID-19, but it's not just, you know, the whole idea is pandemic preparedness or responsiveness. You know, this year and potentially next year we'll have to deal with this virus, but people have been predicting this type of event for many years. And, you know, we even have researchers, for example, like Emma Teeling, who's been working on the genomics of bats and diseases which are kind of resident within bats, and somehow bats tolerate these for, you know, being able to resist cancer or infectious disease. So this very fundamental research could also be used in a health-related context because you can actually have deep mechanistic understanding. I suppose the advantage of somewhere like the Conway is the way it's situated really is it's a kind of a focal point within biomedical research. But we also have, just beside the Conway, we have Ireland's only vet school, so we can actually interact with our colleagues looking at intersection zoonotic disease, where you get diseases which are transferred from animals to humans or from a vector context. We also have, obviously, you know, excellent researchers, fundamental research in the sciences in close proximity. So we have really, I suppose, a critical mass of people across different disciplines, but also a culture where people can actually interact together, both across discipline, but also as what Peter was saying, really with our clinical colleagues. You know what I mean? That's critical. It's shown in terms of the way that people have dealt with the virus is we need to be able to onboard innovations very quickly. So, for example, you know, within a week or two of the virus being identified, we had the gene sequence. A PCR test was developed a couple of weeks later and actually onboarded into the National Virus Reference Laboratory within UCD a couple of weeks after that. And then it was mainstreamed. And so you see that science is really at the heart of this, and the ability to, first of all, a deep scientific understanding allows you to understand the biology underpinning the disease, but also how you actually tackle it in terms of diagnostics or therapeutics. And I suppose the idea is you need, going forward, to be prepared for what is going to come down the track. So you need to have a fundamental basis in terms of your research portfolio. And I think that's what this has shown you, that there's maybe a couple of areas that we can actually, first of all, UCD is good at, as I mentioned previously, but as an area for an opportunity area within UCD. And actually one recent, just giving a particular example, and obviously UCD has hired a good few people recently across different areas, and we've been quite fortunate to hire some really excellent emerging researchers. One of them I want to point out is Dr. Nicola Fletcher. So she was hired under the Ad Astra program, a recruitment program in UCD, and she actually worked on the original SARS-CoV-1 virus. She also worked on Ebola. She worked on, really some significant viruses. And what she's done is actually extraordinary, really. She's been able to really start working now with actual live viral isolate, where she can actually do functional studies. She can actually look at the direct antiviral activity of certain compounds, but also test certain diagnostic tests. So there's two forms of diagnostics which are used. One is PCR and one is antibody testing. And maybe Peter will talk about the clinical applicability of antibody testing. But one of the challenges is with antibody testing, it can give you information on potentially if you were infected, but at the moment we don't know if that means someone is immune or not to the disease. And one key aspect underpinning that is the ability to actually maybe find neutralizing antibodies within a person. If you can actually associate the presence of an antibody that's neutralizing, maybe there's a higher chance that confers immunity or suggests immunity. So again, Peter may be able to talk about the use of those types of antibody tests, maybe in a clinical context.
Yeah, Peter, do you want to fill us in on that? And you're actually doing some particular work on that in the CRC at the moment.
That's right, Orla. So over the last number of years, we've developed a really strong research program in biomarker validation, and that has mainly been biomarkers of end organ damage, which is also a very important topic in COVID-19. But what that has done is it has established a very rigorous program for the evaluation of new biomarker tests. And as Liam just mentioned, one of the challenges we have with antibody testing is not just measuring the amount of antibody in an individual, but measuring the amount of antibody in a reliable way so that maybe we can start making some decisions about next steps for them. So so we have now, for example, commenced a program in partnership with Donald Brennan, who's one of our consultant colleagues at the National Maternity Hospital, and Paddy Mallon and Aoife Cotter are two of our infectious disease consultant colleagues. We're now starting to measure the levels of antibody, of IgG, in samples from patients who have previously tested positive for COVID-19. So for those patients, we have information on how long it is since they were tested, how long it is since they were symptomatic. And what that means is the antibody determinations that we make in those particular patients, we can actually start to get some really good clues as to when do antibody profiles change? How long does it take for an antibody response to be present in a patient? And not only measuring those, but actually also doing the really detailed analytical chemistry to make sure that those assays are reliable. So for example, we're going to measure those antibodies using 3 different high throughput automated platforms. And I think this will probably be one of the most comprehensive antibody profiling experiments that has been completed to date. And what we hope that will do is it will firstly tell us about the reliability of these assays. And this is really, really important, because as we move forward and as we try to return to some type of normality, we'll need additional tools in our armory to be able to understand how the virus has progressed in the population. So being able to measure antibody levels is going to be a really, really important tool for our public health colleagues as they assess the burden of disease. The other thing that it allows us to do, and this is where it links very nicely to what Liam has said, for those patients who have an antibody response, we can then go to the laboratory. For example, our colleague Virginie Gauthier in the Centre for Experimental Pathogen Host Research will be taking those samples to see if there is neutralizing antibodies that Liam mentioned. Those antibodies that will actually neutralize the virus should you be exposed again. So this is, again, it's a really important area for us from a scientific perspective to get a better understanding of the natural history of the infection. But actually, I think it's also a really important contribution to supporting our public health colleagues as they try to broaden out the range of tools that they have to be able to assess the impact of the pandemic on the population. So it's something we're very, very excited to be part of.
And the fact that you have this biobank of samples from other respiratory diseases in the past means that you can look really, really carefully at the test to see, are they picking up the COVID-19 or are they picking up something else?
That's absolutely right, Orla. There's no point in us having an antibody test that is diagnosing something else. So, for example, there's always a concern in these tests about cross-reactivity. Is the test actually picking up a different infection? So as part, and again, going back to this theme of we've been very well prepared, samples have been collected from patients with influenza-like illnesses actually for the last 3 winters. So we're able to go back to those samples that are certainly not COVID positive, and we're able to test our antibody tests in those samples as well. And that's really important because they act as negative controls. And this is a really important piece of analysis because it tells us about how reliable is our test. And ultimately, that's what we want. We don't want to equip our public health colleagues with tests that don't work very well. We want to equip them with tests that have really been validated and understood. And that's the significant body of work that is happening right now.
And there's a theme coming out from both of your contributions about the importance of scientific research, of clinical research, of what we do within a university context, and of doing this research in Ireland, as opposed to just, having other people do the research and then we seek to somehow buy it in here. Liam, would you like to talk to that, the importance of being able to do scientific research within Ireland and within a university like UCD in the context of the pandemic?
Yeah, I think it's critically important. We need a base of research to be able to adopt innovation. You can't expect it to materialize from nothing. So I think the idea is you need a strong research base to build resilience in the system. Again, you don't know where an issue is going to arise. What is shown actually is the depth of expertise in UCD. Like even yesterday, there was a program on TV from a colleague of mine who was in UCD, Professor Orla, who is a fantastic surgeon, but is really doing some amazing work looking at, I suppose, how far respiratory particles spread during normal speech, during, for example, if someone's shouting or close contact. So it's someone that, we have people working in economics, looking at behavioral economics. We have people, like ourselves working in the kind of wet lab sciences or chemists. So again, the project I mentioned, which was the interaction between Gilly and Virginie Gauthier, is an interaction between a chemist and a virologist, both working in separate contexts, but being able to come together very rapidly, really to innovate and develop something that solves a problem. And I think that's the key. You really have to have that depth of expertise, but also at a high level. So it's not just depth, it's, you need top researchers in the field. I think Peter mentioned this, that particularly in something like clinical trials, the ability to reach into clinical networks, Paddy Mallon and Alistair Nicholl, they're kind of leaders in the field. They're hooked into the international context. The same is true in other researchers in biology. UCD really has been home to some kind of leaders in large-scale international programs. So we can actually carry out and provide a conduit for whatever innovations are coming elsewhere, but also be internal innovators that actually go out and bring that out to a wider community. So I think it's extremely important to have that base.
Peter, anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, I think in the clinical trial space, this is actually incredibly interesting, because one of the things we know about clinical trials is that our ability to be able to network internationally whilst leading nationally is really important. So as an example, there's a clinical trial that's called REMAP-CAP. To simplify it, it's what's called a platform trial. So it's looking at different drugs in patients with acquired pneumonias. And that trial, UCD are the Irish lead for that trial, but that trial is happening in a number of different countries globally. And we're not just contributing individual sites to that, but we're actually part of the leadership of that. So Alistair Nicholl, who has been mentioned, is one of the principal investigators in REMAP-CAP. And that gives us this awesome opportunity to talk to colleagues from Australia to Canada and everywhere in between as we try to figure out how to treat this disease. So I think, you know, the really strong kind of national research effort is also influencing these major international programs as well. And I think that's exactly where Ireland is in this space. We're punching well above our weight in terms of the size of the country. And that's a reflection, I think, of the scientific expertise that we have and the hard work that has been done over a number of years in cultivating a culture of inquiry, particularly in this kind of clinical and translational research area. So there's a, you know, I think there's a strong Irish focus, but a very, very strong international linkage as well.
And Peter, how does that help us as we now seek to navigate our way safely out of the pandemic, to reboot the economy, to get society back up to something approaching our old normality? How does this scientific expertise help us in this regard?
Yeah, I think that it does at a number of levels, Orla. Firstly, it makes us very connected to other countries who perhaps are further down the road in terms of their exposure and experience of COVID-19. So for example, at the moment, we have significant discussions ongoing with colleagues in Canada about a clinical trial that is kind of focused on the abnormal clotting that's seen in some of these patients. So we're learning directly from others' experience. We're also then contributing our experience to what others are doing as well. So I think all of this puts us in a place where we're generating new knowledge ourselves and we're leveraging external knowledge. And I think the challenge for us over the coming months is to be able to further understand the virus and its impacts so that we can assist our colleagues in government and in public health as they navigate a way to return to normality, which is really what we want. So you know, I think I remember when the lockdown started, that when I came home from work that evening, my 14-year-old daughter said to me, you know, Dad, what's going to happen? And my immediate response was, you know, well, look, we will, you know, we'll science this, we will figure this out. And I think that's really the phase that we're now at, the work that we're doing. And as Liam mentioned, some of the work that's being done in the Conway and this work around testing and improving that's going to help us to navigate our way forward. Because I think what we all agree is that we want to be part of a solution that allows our economy to reopen. Where we're at right now is not something that we can stick with for an extended period of time. So every single experiment we do, every piece of research we do, to me, is helping us on that pathway to returning to normality.
And Liam, what's your view on this, the path back to normality and how that can be assisted through science?
Yeah, like I suppose just kind of thinking more laterally, you know, obviously the focus of our discussion today is around COVID-19, but we exist in an environment where we experience other disorders as well. So for example, my particular focus is in the area of cancer. For example, we have investigators within the Conway focusing on diabetes or other chronic disorders. And we see this kind of interesting intersection between this viral disease and individuals who have other comorbidities. And I suppose that's a challenge, is that we have individuals which have different inherent risks and how to deal with that. So you've got someone that may not have a comorbidity and can maybe have a certain amount of interaction in terms of work practice. And then you've got individuals who are at risk currently. And so that can provide significant challenges. So it's how to deal with that and how to be able to target screening and testing towards those groups. It's really around testing. There's some discussions, for example, at the moment in terms of, obviously the main way to deal with this is really regular testing, contact tracing, etc. But maybe in an occupational health, there's some discussions ongoing, maybe to actually introduce testing. We've seen this, whether it's correct or not, if in certain areas of sport in the UK and in the US, where individuals are tested and probably cleared. You see this, for example, in certain airports, for example, where as passengers arrive or before they're departed, they're tested. I think the jury is still out of whether these types of approaches are fully effective, but the key anchor is around testing and have the appropriate testing approaches. And what we've seen is this explosion of different types of testing. So one particular test that's very useful are these rapid tests, and where you can actually very quickly, within less than an hour, in some cases 20 minutes, in a very simple manner, test individuals. And I think we had a quick chat earlier on this evening with Peter about this idea of these tests are potentially useful in certain settings, which are maybe difficult to deal with. And I don't know if Peter wants to elaborate on it, but these are areas where maybe UCD and its affiliated hospitals can also get involved in an area of social responsibility as well.
Yeah, Peter, do you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this again was a very interesting new departure for us. Early on in the course of the pandemic, we were contacted by the Safety Net group, who many people will be familiar with. They're a primary care group who provide primary care and healthcare to the homeless and other marginalized groups in the city. And the homeless were identified very early on as a population at significant risk from COVID-19. It's very difficult for a homeless person to self-isolate, for example. So they contacted us and asked if we could help them with the testing that they needed to do. So we established that in partnership with the Safety Net group and Professor Jack Lambert at the Mater Hospital. And again, I think as Liam mentioned, is another, I think, quite nice example of how the university can flex its resources and its facilities and its infrastructures to really support groups like Safety Net who are doing such impressive work in a very vulnerable population during this pandemic.
Final quick question for both of you. What do you most need to advance your research into the pandemic? Peter, maybe I might ask you first.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think the challenge for us going forward over the next, and as Liam mentioned, it's not the next 6 months, it's the next number of years. The challenge for us is to broaden our funding so that we can continue the type of inquiry that is ongoing at the moment, that curiosity-driven research that is also supporting improving outcomes for our patients. So the biggest need for us going forward is to develop and create new funding strands that will be through both national government, through international initiatives like the European Union, but then also the important funding that the foundation working with the supporters of the university can leverage as well. So that for us is probably our biggest challenge over the coming years, Orla.
Thanks, Peter. And Liam, for you?
In particular, I think there's a big opportunity really to build on the amazing research that takes place, particularly in the virology and infectious disease area, and particularly in the area of biosafety level 3 facilities within UCD. I think there's a big opportunity there. We have 2 facilities which potentially could be upgraded, and there's a big opportunity because, again, there's people who are doing ongoing work in TB, other infectious diseases, and the idea is that, you know, we don't want those activities to fall fallow while you're trying to deal with the current response. So there's a big opportunity really of consolidating and building on what's already you know, working well within UCD, but could be improved going forward.
Okay, well, on that note, we'll draw things to a conclusion. So Liam and Peter, thank you very, very much for your time. You're very busy, as are all your colleagues in your various institutes and centres at this time. So thank you very much for giving of your expertise. Thanks to the UCD Foundation for facilitating. Thanks to all of you who joined us. We hope that it has been informative. You may also find the webinar that we did with Killian de Gascoon and Paddy Mallon also interesting. So thank you for your time. Thank you again, Peter and Liam, for all that you and your colleagues are doing, and take care and stay safe, everyone. Thank you.